Thank you for watching again. This is the Nobody Oxfordian channel. This is part 2 of the Catalogue of Honor and Edward Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford. As I go through this book, I'm unsure how many parts there will be, but this one's just as interesting. There are two criticisms that I received from the last video that I wanted to talk about briefly. The first is this star. Yes, I know it's the star on the De Vere flag, but there's an emblem or something hanging off of it. It looks like there's an A hanging off of it. And since the photographs from the Folgers library are a low definition, it's difficult to tell what this is. I'm unsure of what they're trying to portray in adding this A underneath the star. We will have to wait until higher resolution photographs are available. The second was the timing of the folio in the Catalogue of Honor when I referred to Hamlet and Henry VI. Now, Edward de Vere supposedly died in 1604. The Catalogue of Honor was published in 1610, which means it was being worked on prior to 1610, and the folio was published in 1623, which also means it was being worked on prior to that. We don't know how many years it took to put the folio together. The Shakespeare Oxfordian website has suggested that Philip and William Herbert and Susan Vere were in possession of the manuscripts since they were the patrons of the folio. But we do believe that Henry VI, Part 3, was first introduced to the world in 1595, and Hamlet was published and introduced to the world between 1595 and 1603. So I believe it is reasonable to assume that the manuscripts were available to the publishers and authors of the 1610 Catalogue of Honor. If not hard copies of the manuscript, then certainly the plays performed enough that the authors would have had ample time to watch, write, and take notes of the plays, to be familiar with the dialogue, the verbiage used, the characters. So when I used the Catalogue of Honor and showed how the double E's in Edward referred back to Henry VI, Act 5, Scene 5, I think that is legitimate to say. The play was available. They would have been able to read it and would have known Edward de Vere's personal struggles and how it played out in his writings of that section. However, to say that the Catalogue of Honor printed uncle to reference to Hamlet's uncle in the folio is incorrect. This is most likely since both the Catalogue of Honor and the folio were published by the same printer. This is just how they wrote uncle. Although possible that the folio used uncle in this typeset to refer back or link to the Catalogue of Honor, that just seems unlikely they would have had that forward thought. But I still do believe that the reference in the Catalogue of Honor to an individual whose wife poisoned him is played out in Hamlet, and that the author of the Catalogue of Honor is trying to make the connection to the reader. In the last video, I hammered home the Prince of Wales section, but left off the title page. The Prince of Wales section starts on page 290, which means the title page is 289. This chapter comes on the heels of King James's section that ended on page 241, had 4 blank pages, and they skipped ahead to 289. Must be a coincidence that they went from 241 to 289. As most of the audience knows, 24 is Queen Elizabeth's secret code number in the correspondence with King James, who was number 30. And 40 is a number that Edward Vere used. Is it coincidence that the section dealing with King James starts on page 240? Now that is 24 and 40. And that the page ends on 241. Again, 24, and then 41. 41 would have been Edward Vere's son. Is it coincidence that on page 40 of this book, it starts with Edward, spelled with 2 V's, by the grace of God, King of England and of France, and Edward, by the grace of God, King of England and of France, is 12 letters. 12 is M, M is mem, mem is 40. So if at this point you still think this is all coincidence, you just got to stop watching these kind of videos. The first Prince of Wales individual is on page 290, which makes the catalog title page on 289. Like I said before, they had skipped ahead from King James's page 241. Is this coincidence, or is there another reason? Well, 289, if we add the digits together, we come to 19. 19 is the combination of 7 for Edward VII and 12. 12, as we've discussed before, is M in Latin gematria. M is mem in Hebrew, which is equal to 40. So we have the 40th monarch. So page 289 represents 7 and 12. Edward de Vere's numbers in his signature. So this title page comprises 10 lines. Starts with A and ends with the date, MDCX, which is 1610. Again, it's not 11, it's not 13, it's 12, and 12 is 40. And we have 32 words, starting with A is the first, and Jagged being the 32nd. So 32 in repeated Latin gematria are 2 I's that represent 11. John Anthony's pointed this out before, and this seems to be the building block for the twice 11 brethren. So on the 12th line, something of interest that caught my eye was how they spaced the date, MDCX, and that is in Roman numerals 1610. Now, it might be common. Someone can comment in the comment section for us for them to do this kind of spacing to where they separate out or group together certain Roman numerals, but I don't think that's as common. It's certainly not the way that they're supposed to do it. It should be just MDCX for 1610 without the dots. But what caught my eye was the M, and I started to count. So M dot DC dot X dot are 7 characters. So we have 7 characters here. M is, as we know, 12, represents 40, but the Latin gematria of M is 12. Latin gematria of DC, 4 and 3, spaced together. I added those to 7, so now we have 12, 7, and then X is 21. So if we add 12, 7, 21 together, we get 40. It's an interesting coincidence, isn't it? That within the date, 1610, we have 740. Again, the numbers in Edward de Vere's signature. So did they randomly choose 1610? Is it coincidence that's the date that the catalog was written? Or did they publish it on this date? Or was it published in a different year but assigned the 1610 date? Think about your own books. How many of us look at the books and look for the publication date? Even in today's society, it is tradition to put those publication dates in Roman numerals. How many of them are spaced out? How many of them have dots? How many of them are accurate for the actual date of publication? We never look. Maybe the book was published in 1610. Maybe it was published closer to 1623. Maybe it was published closer to 1604. We do know William Jagged died in 1623, so it's likely this was published prior to his death. And so I went back and looked at each chapter page, and they all have this date this way. Spacing's a little different, might be a little closer together, but each chapter page is walking around with 740. There's more to this, and I'll get to that in just a moment. 1610, we can also add 16 and 10 together to get 26. 26 in repeated Latin gematria is C, 2 C's, and C is 3, so we have 33, and that's the number of the Trinity. Interesting they chose 1610 as the date of publication. And in the middle of the page is this beautiful Tudor rose. So let me spend a little time here with this date again. We put back the letters and the numbers 12, 4, 3, 21. One of the things I noticed was if I added 12 and 4 together, I got 16. And when I added 3 and 21 together, I got 24, sandwiched in between 7. So we have 16, which we know to be the 16th Earl of Oxford, John. 7, Edward VII, our buddy. And 24 is Queen Elizabeth's code number. These relationships started to remind me of something I stumbled upon before, and that was John Dee's Pythagorean quaternary. It's a hard word for me to say, so this will be the only time you hear me say it. I am by no means an expert on John Dee. It's very confusing to me, but this specific mathematical equation in his book is interesting. It's Theorem 23, and I would recommend you look it up, study it. It is part of what they're doing back during this time with their coding. So what he does is he takes the numbers 1, 2, 3, and 4. If you add them together, you get 10, which happens to be Robert Cecil's secret correspondence number. If you take 1, 2, 3, and 4 and multiply them together, so you have 1 times 2 is 2, 2 times 3 is 6, 6 times 4 is 24. You get Eliza, or Queen Elizabeth's secret code number. And then John Dee went on to add these numbers together. So we get 1 plus 2 is 3, 2 plus 3 is 5, 3 plus 4 is 7. And then he adds the first and third digit. 1 plus 3 is 4, 2 plus 4 is 6, and then he adds the last two digits together, 1 and 4, to come up with 5. So each additional line, it's 3, 5, and 7 equal 15, 6 and 4 equal 10, and 5 is itself 5. So you add 15, 10, and 5 together, and you get 30, King James's secret code number. And if you add all the numbers within the Pythagorean quaternary, we get 40. Which I believe to be Edward de Vere's secret code number in the correspondence. I planned on doing another video on that specifically at a later date, but I think it's important here. Now, John Dee did not use the summation of all the numbers in his theorem, but since Edward Vere uses 40 as identification, I do believe that they would have quickly adopted summation of all the parts in other codings that they would have done. So if we follow John Dee's Theorem 23, the Pythagorean quaternary, we'll add the sum of the digits 12, 4, 3, and 21 for 40. Now we do the math for the parts, and that's 12 plus 4 is 16, 4 plus 3 is 7, 3 plus 21 is 24. Add those together and we get 47. Now what is 47 for them? I think it is the two numbers in his signature, 40 and 7. So again, we see 740. 7 in Latin gematria is G, so we can also have 40 and G for God. So Edward Vere and God. Then we have the second part, 12 plus 3 is 15. 4 plus 21 is 25. Add those together, we get 40. And for the third part, we add 12 and 21, we get 33. 33 is Trinity, 333. If you recall Alexander Wall's video on this, 333 is 9, Jesus Christos. Just to clarify, I'm implying 3 times 3 is 9, so 3 threes. Then if we ask for all possibilities, that would be 12 times 4 times 3 times 21, and that is 3024, or 30 and 24. King James, Queen Elizabeth. So let's add the sum of the parts. 47, 40, and 33 is 120. If we add all the numbers in the quaternary, we get 160. So is 120 supposed to represent 12, M, Mem, and 40? And is 160 supposed to represent 16, John de Vere, the 16th Earl of Oxford? I actually think what they're trying to say here is 40. So 3 40s equal 120, and 4 40s equal 160, for a total of 7 40s, 740. There are 10 hidden 40s for Edward Vere. There's a 24 for Queen Elizabeth. There's a 30 for King James. there's a G for God and a 9 for Jesus Christos. Without written contemporary letters providing some sort of key or backdrop, we are left wondering why these names continue to appear together. But these three individuals would have known and would have had to agree to a peaceful transition to King James with the blessing of God, and I am unsure if Jesus being here is symbolic for the sacrifice Edward de Vere made. So John Dee also used a Pythagorean artificiale. What that means during Elizabethan time is not artificial as we understand it, but man-made. So I started to wonder if Edward de Vere was the son of Queen Elizabeth and the rightful heir or 40th monarch, then placing James into that position was man-made and not by hereditary right or nature. The change John Dee made for the artificial Pythagorean is instead of 1, 2, 3, 4, he did 1, 2, 3, 2. So I took the numbers, instead of it being 12, 4, 3, 21, I used the second number, 4, again. So let's use 12, 4, 3, 4, and see what we come up with. So what is the summary of the digits? 12, 4, 3, and 4 equal 23. It's an odd number. We haven't seen that before. I looked it up on the Latin Grammatria, and it is letter Z. During the Elizabethan time, Z was pronounced Z. So what are the permutations of 12, 4, 3, and 4? Multiplying those all together, we get 576. It's an odd number. We haven't seen that before. So the next part, we add 12 and 4, 16, 4 and 3 and 7, 3 and 4 and 7. Adding 16, 7, and 7 together, we get 30. Okay, that's King James's secret code number. Finally, something we recognize. Okay, the next summary is 12 and 3 for 15, and 4 and 4 for 8. 15 and 8 is 23. There it is again, Z. Z. Then we have 16, which is the addition of 12 and 4. Again, 16, are they trying to refer to John de Vere, the 16th Earl? Or is it 6 plus 1 is 7, Edward the 7th? Don't know. So what are the sum of the parts? 30, 23, and 16 is 69. It's a different number. We haven't seen that before either. Went back to the chart, and repeated gematria for 69 is 3 Z's. 3 Z's. It's strange. Now, if we add all the numbers together in this Pythagorean equation, we get 92. And in Latin gematria, 92 is 4 Z's. 4 Z's. Very strange. With so many Z's on this page, we looked up what Z or Z meant in the Elizabethan era. It was considered a useless letter. In fact, in King Lear, William Shakespeare's play, Act 2, Scene 2, Kent saying to Oswald, the servant, "Thou worrisome Z, thou unnecessary letter." So the Earl of Kent was reminding the servant he was unnecessary. Then my eyes turned to the permutation of 576, and I wondered, what does this have to do with anything? How many Z's are in 576? Well, there are 24. Queen Elizabeth's number. There are 24 Z's in 576 with a remainder of 24. This is most certainly coincidence. So again, we have 30 on this page. We have 24 on this page. We have 7 by means of 6 plus 1 is 7 for Edward Vere on this page, with 33 Z's. Jesus Christos. So again, without contemporary documentation, we are left to wonder, are we being told that Edward Vere was unnecessary? Or the man-made quaternary, which is that of King James, being the man-made heir, unnecessary because Edward was the son of Queen Elizabeth? The next two slides just use other known dates in this theorem breakdown with all the additions. So look at it at your leisure. 1623, 1604. This is the chapter on the Earls of Oxford. I thought it would be useful to see what the chapter looks like and the overall size when compared to my hand. From the catalog page to the last page are exactly 29 pages. But if we think the catalog starts with the first individual, this is Edgar, they added a blank page at the end for 29. And as we know, 29 is 17 plus 12. 12 is M is mem is 40 for 1740. So even the chapter is marked as 1740. So for this section, I'm going to go through each Earl of Oxford in the De Vere family, point out how they are named, and point out how the earlship is also named. We'll also point out odd additions made by the author, and will in the end make my point for this video. The first Earl of Oxford is Aubrey de Vere, so named de Vere, and it is for the Earl of Oxford. The next in line is also Aubrey de Vere, the second Earl of Oxford. He died in the 17th year of the reign of King John without lawful issue. I bring this up because this is the Catalogue of Honor. There's a section about Penelope Rich that was torn out of most of these books. But for this individual, the editor chose to mention that he died without lawful issue, meaning he had an illegitimate child. And that fact was put into the book. The third Earl of Oxford is Robert de Vere. He was brother to Aubrey de Vere, the second Earl of Oxford. This is the Robert de Vere from the first video, which I used the epitaph to show that the earlship was numbered, and also pointed out that the epitaph says Sir Robert of Vere. The author is reminding us that DE of Vere, de Vere, means of Vere, of the family. So the next Earl is Hugh de Vere. He is the fourth Earl of Oxfordy. So here they use the word Oxfordy. But a few sentences later, they reverted back to Hugh, Earl of Oxford. This is Robert de Vere. He was the second of that name. He was the fifth Earl of Oxford. The next is Robert of Vere, the third of that name, surnamed the good Earl of Oxford. Seems that the editor is using of and d interchangeably, and reminding the reader that de in de Vere means to be of the Veres. So Robert of Vere, Robert de Vere. I wonder if this is an oversight or a typo on the part of the editor. The next is John de Vere, the seventh Earl of Oxford. The next is Thomas de Vere, Earl of Oxford. being the 8th Earl of Oxford. Next is Robert de Vere, the 4th of that name, and Earl of Oxford, being the 9th Earl of Oxford. Something interesting, as I mentioned before, in the Catalogue of Honor, they do mention that this gentleman foretook his noble lady and wife Philip and took another of base parenting. Doesn't seem very honorable. And it ends with Aubrey de Vere. The next is Aubrey de Vere, the 5th of that name, and the Earl of Oxford, he being the 10th Earl of Oxford. The next is Richard de Vere, Earl of Oxford, and this is our first typo. They have him as the 10th Earl of Oxford, but he was actually the 11th Earl of Oxford. And notice the small r in Latin gematria is 17, a very small r in the font. Aubrey de Vere is also listed in this page. The next is John de Vere. This is the 12th Earl of Oxford. Here they say Oxfordy, and this is a misprint. He is not the 11th, but the 12th. The next Earl is John de Vere. He was the 3rd of that name, and the editor has gone back to the correct count as 13 Earl of Oxford. Oxford spelled like all the others, except the 12th Earl, who was Oxfordy. This is also the first page to where we see a Vere without de. The editor left it off, and I think in this case it was left off to distinguish this John de Vere from his brother George's son, John de Vere. So they left that off so it catches the reader attention that there is a different John. So on his page, they return to John de Vere, the 4th of that name, referring him as the Earl of Oxford, and that he was son of George Vere. Again, they left off the de, but this is not George de Vere's page. And at the bottom, they refer to the next Earl as John Vere, leaving off the de, because this is the page for John de Vere the 4th, who died without issue, so the successor is John Vere, the 5th of that name, again to bring attention to the reader that we are speaking of two different John de Veres. So I believe they left de off of George Vere for spacing, and they put it in would have been hyphenated. So the next is John de Vere. He's the 5th of that name and was the Earl of Oxford. And they're back on count with 15. There are a number of de Veres and Oxfords listed. And the next is John de Vere, and he is named Earl of Oxford, being the 16th. If you notice, this is a much shorter description of the man's life compared to the Oxfords that preceded him. I think this is an unusual finding. There are certainly people still alive at the publication of this book that would have known who John de Vere was, and so we would think that the information provided would be more detailed. And as customary in this book, there's always a section that follows each Earl, Duke, King for the children of the various wives. And here we find the first official mentioning of Edward. And it says Edward Vere, lowercase v, Earl of Oxford, after the death of his father. Edward first appears on page 699. 6 plus 9 plus 9 is 24. Elizabeth's secret code number. Now for the crazy 40th monarch theory. Notice the hereditary line here. Edward, Mary, Elizabeth, Edward. So to have a little fun, Oxford is directly above italicized Peregrine Bertie. Peregrine means outlandish, and Bertie means noble or bright. outlandish noble, or our outlandish bright. And now we've come to our buddy, Edward Vere. This book was printed in 1610, which means a few years prior was whenever they were getting everything together. And we are told that Edward de Vere died in 1604. He died a few years prior at the age of 54, and this is all they wrote for him. Edward Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford, Visconti Boulebec, Lord Sandford and Balestimer, and Lord High Chamberlain of England, was the only son and heir of John the 16th, Earl of Oxford. He died the 24th of June, 1604, and was buried at Hackney. Individuals who died 600 years prior to him had more detail and information in their biography than this man, who died 6 years prior to the publication of this book. Besides the size of the letters and lack of information, the first thing that struck me when I first saw this page was Edward Vere. Not Edward de Vere, Edward Vere. Remember, de means of, and the editor and writer on 2 occasions that I've shown you reminded us in the Oxford section that it was Robert of Vere. That de means of. So in this situation, they have chosen to write Edward Vere. Not Edward of the Veres, but Edward Vere. This is also the 3rd time that we see the word Oxfordy. Not Oxford, but Oxfordy. But in the same paragraph, John the 16th Earl is Oxford. My next video, I plan to cover Oxfordy over Oxford and why I think that's happening. So if we start with Edward and count only words, we have, of course, 40. Notice how 16 and 24 are lined up. We add those together, we get 40. Is the author trying to tell us there is more than an earl to monarch relationship between the 16th Earl of Oxford, John, and 24, Queen Elizabeth? Am I the only one that thinks 1604 is the death date for Edward Vere to be suspicious? It has the same numbers. If we just change the 4 and 0, we get 1640. John de Vere, Edward Vere. Funny coincidence. So if we look at the date, 1562, written on the left column, 15 and 62, if we add them together, which has been tradition in this book, we get 77. And again, 77 in the repeated gematria is 4 H's. Each H is an 8. So we have 4 8s. Split those off into 2 88s. And as we've known and discussed previously, that is 4 T's or 40. So we have 2 40s in the date of 1562, which tells me there may be 2 clues on this page. Now if we start counting with Edward and we count out to 19, we come to was, which is a sentence separated by a comma. Now why is 19 important? Since we've been looking for 7 and 40 from his signature, 19 is the combination of 7 and 12, and as we know, 12 is M is mem is 40. I think 19 has become an important number for us to start looking for. Then if we continue counting from was, heir is on 24. 24 is the secret correspondence code for Elizabeth. Pretty sketchy. 19 and 24 was an heir. Probably thinking I'm trying to push something. So let's count from the back. Start at Hackney and work our way backwards. Heir lands on, you guessed it, 17. And was on 22. Twice 11 brethren. And of course, Earl of Oxford lies right below the sentence. Only son and heir. And I think the other clue I'd already shown at the last page was 16 and 24 is 40. So we have John de Vere, Elizabeth, and Edward Vere hold some sort of close relationship. This is a typical page for the de Vere family in this book. The person that is discussed in the paragraph is always referred to as de Vere. There are times in this catalog in which individuals that are secondary on this page, meaning brothers, sons, may be referred to Vere only. That is for spacing and to distinguish it from the other de Vere on the page that may have the same first name. And I showed that before. When an individual has one wife, their children are referred to as their issue. When an individual has had two wives, they distinguish and use the verbiage children of the first wife and children of the second wife. The headings on all members of this family are de Vere. The V in Vere varies between a U-shaped V and a sharp V, and I cannot see a pattern as to why that might be, but the typeset of the pages are consistent with John de Vere, Robert de Vere, Edward de Vere. And then this is the page for our friend Edward Vere. And if you notice, the typeset on the top is consistent with all of the other Veres in the family, saying Edward de Vere. I personally believe that this is just a secondary individual setting up the framing of the page and not the author's input. Critics of the next section may use this as a reason for not believing what I'm about to say. None of us were there when this book was put together, so there is no notes as to how they did this and why they did things a certain way. We're essentially just going through the dark, but we're finding consistent patterns in a message. For example, up to this point, there are 700 pages. There are misprinted pages, pages without numbers, all leading to Edward Vere, landing on page 700. So if we add these numbers together, the first two with the second two, has been tradition, we have 7. If we add all 3 digits together, we have 7. What is the likelihood that a gentleman who signs his name Edward VII, who may believe himself the 40th monarch, that the editor and author of this book would have ensured he landed on page 700? The plain statistical chance is 0.14%. 0.14% chance that a topic lands on a specific page at this point. Add in all of the other coincidences, and the statistical chance is extremely low that this is random. Each paragraph starts with that individual's name. And so I've laid those out here. I've added the first letter because it's usually in the decorative piece, and I've numbered them. So at first we have Aubrey de Vere. Second we have Aubrey de Vere. Third we have Robert de Vere. Fourth we have Hugh de Vere, Robert de Vere, John de Vere, Thomas de Vere, Robert de Vere, Aubrey de Vere, Richard de Vere, John de Vere, John de Vere, John de Vere, John de Vere, and John de Vere. And we end with Edward Vere. So the editor left off of. So are they telling us that Edward is not a Vere? That Edward is Vere, perhaps adopted? As I showed you before, his page has exactly 40 words. You cannot dismiss this and say they removed to get to 40. They would have removed a different word because this is the main page of description for that individual. Are there places to where they do remove to make room for spacing? Yes, but those are secondary characters on that page. They also do it to distinguish between 2 John de Veres written in the same paragraph. It catches the reader's eye to allow them to distinguish between the two people being discussed in the paragraph. But at no point do they remove "the" from the body of the descriptive paragraph in dealing with that specific individual. They do so with Edward Vere, and that is up to interpretation on your part. It is my interpretation. It's done intentionally, and it's done to tell the reader, those who knew, that he is Edward Vere, not Edward of the Veres. And it also helps explain why the De Vere family, after 1603, did not embrace Edward Vere. He was not part of their family. He was an adoption. He was an addition. He belonged to the Tudor line, which is now dead. The De Veres had been very loyal to the Lancastrian cause. Few of them were beheaded. One helped Henry VII take the throne, so they were a trusted family. And it is my interpretation that this trusted family was trusted to take on Edward Vere, the Tudor, a gentleman who signed his name Edward VII, 40. A gentleman who was sued by his half-sister Catherine over the inheritance of the Earlship of Oxford, a man who was blocked from obtaining the rightful ownership of that inheritance, a man who spent lavishly with the idea there was more to come, a man who could write plays about court life, mocking some without retribution, a man who wrote a letter to his brother-in-law that when Elizabeth died, she left him without anchor or sail. So for those that would say the editor or author chose to use Edward Vere instead of Edward de Vere as a matter of practicality or style, I would refer you back to this painting, completed by an unknown artist in Paris in 1575. Edward Vere sent this to his wife as a gift. And if we look at the text, it says Edward Vere. Now that W in Edward looks like it's spelled R-U. I'm not sure if that was the norm at that period of time. Now we may say that this text was added after his death, at a time when the De Vere family didn't want anything to do with him. But if we look at the handwriting, the first section is different style of writing and a different paint color. The word "of" in the first section is similar to each other, but certainly different than the second half of the writing. Lord is written twice, written by different hands. The word daughter for the Anne Cecil section is slightly different than the Elizabeth Trenton section. The G is different, the H is different, the T is different, and the E is different. So the description portion about who this painting is written by one hand, and at a later date, the section about his wives are written by another hand. That other hand may be two different people, or it may be at two different times with subtle changes in the scribe. So it is reasonable to assume that these three sentences were written at the time that they occurred. So Edward Vere was written at the time the painting was produced. The Anne Cecil portion was added after the marriage of Edward to Anne. And then the section on Elizabeth Trenton was again added after the marriage. And since this painting was in the possession of Edward Vere's home as a gift sent to his wife, he has chosen to call himself Edward Vere. Other than all of these fitting on 7 lines, there is no number code here that I can find. A few videos ago I went over Edward de Vere's signature, and I wanted to present these again here. These are all the different characteristics of his signature throughout his lifetime. I have yet to find a signature where he signed it Edward Vere or referred to himself as a Vere. I have looked at many of his letters and I've hunted down as many of his signatures that I could, and not once have I seen him refer to himself as Vere or sign his name other than Edward Oxford in some fashion, whether it's Oxenford, Oxyford, Oxenford, or finally Oxenfordy. No Edward Vere in his hand. The memorial in Westminster Abbey for Anne Cecil, Edward's first wife, lists Edward as Edward Vere, not Edward de Vere. It says Anne was married to Edward, Earl of Oxford, not Edward de Vere. Their first child was Elizabeth Vere, not Elizabeth de Vere. Their second child was Bridget. Vere was not listed with her name. And their last child, Susan, was also not listed with Vere as her last name. So how does the Catalogue of Honor deal with his children from Anne Cecil? The first Elizabeth was married to William Stanley, the Earl of Derby, in which it says he took the wife Elizabeth, eldest daughter of Edward Vere, not Edward de Vere. The Catalogue of Honor ends with Susan, his youngest daughter, with Anne Cecil, and there's no mention that she is Susan de Vere or Susan Vere, and Edward is just listed as Edward Earl of Oxford. It says Susan, youngest daughter, unto Edward Earl of Oxford, and of Anne his wife, daughter to Sir William Cecil, gives his last name, but Edward is just Edward Earl of Oxford. And would anyone like to guess how many lines and how many words comprises the final page of the book, Edward de Vere's daughter, Susan? So I think the evidence here suggests from the Catalogue of Honor listing him as Edward Vere, the painting that is most familiar to all of us has him as Edward Vere. His first wife's tomb lists him as Edward Vere. His signature never included Vere. His children in the Catalogue of Honor are not listed as Veres, suggest that Edward was not a de Vere, but just a Vere, likely to be placed in the home adopted by John de Vere, the 16th Earl of Oxford. So let's return to the issue page for John de Vere, the 16th Earl of Oxford, in which this is the first appearance of Edward Vere. Again, it is Edward Vere, not Edward de Vere. Now, if we count words, Edward is the first, and father, which is capitalized, is the 11th. Did they choose not to put D in to not make the 40? Or is it more important that it say Edward Vere and not Edward de Vere to get the 40? So again, I think we're looking at intention on the behalf of the editor, that Edward Vere is more important than spelling out 40. So this sentence says Edward Vere, Earl of Oxford, after the death of his father. So let's look at other ways issues were introduced to the world in this book. The 16th Earl of Oxford was introduced as John de Vere, Earl of Oxford after his father. They did not use death of his father. This is the page for the 12th Earl of Oxford, Robert de Vere. His son Aubrey de Vere was beheaded with him one day prior for supporting the Lancasters. So his son, John de Vere, the third of that name, Earl of Oxford. No recording of the death of his father. Thomas de Vere, Earl of Oxford after his father. And Aubrey de Vere, Knight of the Garter and Earl of Oxford after the decease of Robert, Duke of Ireland, his nephew. So in this case, they say after the decease of Robert Duke. So his nephew died, and they add that in. But not for his brother, Thomas de Vere, Earl of Oxford, after his father. Then we have Aubrey de Vere, the second Earl of Oxford, after his father, and Robert de Vere, Earl of Oxford, after his brother. Let's look at different earlships. Robert Devereux, now Earl of Essex, after his father, no mention of death. Another Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex, after his father, no mention of death. Does record his birth date, though. Geoffrey Mandule, Earl of Essex, after his father, and of Gloucester. William Mandule, Earl of Essex, after his brother, no mention of death. So here are 3 additional Mandules, all of which are Earls of Essex, after his father, after his brother, no mention of death. So let's look at Henry Vere. Again, not Henry de Vere, Henry Vere. They record his birth date, born on 1592, and they go on to say, and now is the 18th Earl of Oxford. Where is the comment about after his father? Where is the comment of him taking over the earlship after the death of his father? This book was printed in 1610. We are told by the description in this book that Edward de Vere died 1604. So Henry de Vere line should read, Henry de Vere, Earl of Oxford, after his father. Or, to be in consistency with his father's line, it should read, Henry Vere, Earl of Oxford, after the death of his father. You're going to have to be a staunch denier if you take this, the other information that I've shown, and what others have shown in their videos, and declare that this is coincidence. These are happenstance examples. There is one more intentional subtlety in this sentence. Edward Vere, Earl of Oxford, after the death of his father, preceded by the sentence of children by his second wife. Notice the second comma. This is the only sentence in which they've added a second comma after Oxford. Notice here, Thomas de Vere, again de Vere, Earl of Oxford after his father, as opposed to Edward's sentence, Edward Vere, Earl of Oxford, after the death of his father. Thomas de Vere, Earl of Oxford after his father. Let me say that again. Edward Vere, Earl of Oxford, after the death of his father. Thomas of Vere, Earl of Oxford after his father. This comma is the most important punctuation in the Edward VII, 40th monarch argument. So Earl of Oxford is a non-restrictive element because it's describing a noun. In this case, Edward Vere, and that has already been defined by being in the Oxford section. Since he is the first, quote, born in the issue page, we already know that he is an Earl of Oxford. Because of that second comma, we can remove Earl of Oxford and it does not change the meaning of the sentence. The comma separates it from the death. So he is not Earl of Oxford because of the death of his father. He is a child from his second wife after the death of his father. Unlike Thomas de Vere, the lack of a comma makes the meaning of the sentence that the earldom was obtained after his father. And we know this is from death because that is how the titles are passed from one generation to the next. If Edward's section had been only after his father, so it read Edward Vere, Earl of Oxford, after his father, then the argument that a comma was a typo would be sound. So I've shown you that after the death of his father is not a needed description and not used anywhere else in this catalog except here. And in no other section did they use a second comma separating Earl of Oxford or any earlship or dukedom from after his father. So I think they are telling us Edward Vere became a Vere after the death of his father. So here is Edward and Henry's issue page. Edward Vere, Earl of Oxford, after the death of his father. What I'm sure is coincidence, under Oxford and father, they listed Peregrine Bertie. He was the Lord Willoughby of Eresby. What's interesting about him is his parents left England under Queen Mary I because of their Protestant beliefs. Their lands were seized because they ignored commands from her to return. Once Queen Elizabeth took the throne, they returned to England. They had to have their son naturalized, or a more poetic way of saying it is, England adopted him. And we know the date. It happened on August 2nd, 1559. It's ironic that a man who was adopted by England is underneath a man who may have been adopted himself. We have the order of succession: Edward, Mary, Elizabeth, Edward. And to compare to Henry Vere's issue page, in which nothing is mentioned about his father, and he is just now the Earl of Oxford. And of course, Oxford is the 12th word of that sentence. Let's talk about some other interesting things about this page. Edward de Vere's first wife was named Anne Cecil. His second wife was Catherine Tretham. Not Anne Tretham, but Catherine. Perhaps Anne is a nickname, but certainly in this catalog it should be Catherine, her formal name. Something of interest: Anne, A-N-N-E. Latin gematria of that is 1, 13, 13, 5 for 32, and repeated Latin gematria of 32 is double I's, resembling 11. So here we have two Annes, double 11, twice brethren. John Anthony has pointed out double A's associated with William Shakespeare and Edward Vere. In here, on his wives' page, are two prominent A's. The Latin gematria of A is 1, so we have 11 on this page. So is Edward de Vere's two wives, Anne and Anne, A and A, the source and inspiration for this header? This header appears in the Catalogue of Honor, this book, as well as the first folio. And John Anthony has posted a video on this double A, including this portrait that we think is Edward Vere with the double A's and the two 8s for 88 4T. Definitely worth checking out. I want to take a moment and look at Henry Wolsey's page. I may have said before there were no other pages that dealt with or commented after the death. This is the only one I could find, and I wanted to make the correction. If we notice the punctuation, it says Henry Wolsey, parentheses, son and heir of Henry II, Earl of Southampton, parentheses. The verb was, after the death of his father, capital F, the third Earl of Southampton of this family. This is structurally much different than Edward Vere, Earl of Oxford, after the death of his father. We can remove the parentheses and read this sentence as Henry Wolsey was after the death of his father, the third Earl of Southampton, opposed to Edward Vere, Earl of Oxford, after the death of his father. Structurally completely different sentences with different meanings. The Henry sentence would have been the way to write the Edward sentence if the editor wasn't trying to make the point that Edward became a Vere after the death of his father. Let's look at Henry Wolsey's issue page. He was married to Elizabeth. Seems like everyone was named Elizabeth. I'm going to assume everyone's seen Alexander Waugh's excellent presentation on the true parents of Henry Vere. And look at the spectacular typo. The author, editor, typesetter put in Henry Lord Wolsey. I'm sorry, but this is validation of Alexander Waugh's theory. This is not an oops. This is not a typographical error. Of all the names to choose from, Henry is chosen as the error. Now you might argue that there is no way they would have done this in the presence of Robert Cecil or the fear that King James may read this book. But they provided themselves cover. There is an errata or an error page at the end of the book, and they clarify the mistake. So if anyone came to them, they can say, yes, we saw that error, we made a correction on the correction page. We couldn't go back and reprint X amount of books. But like today, who stays for the credits page? Who's going to look at the correction page and go back and reference where that correction was made? One person, the owner of this previous book. No one else is going to do that. And this owner may have already known the correct answer of James and not even reference the correction page. But I'm sure this is coincidence, happenstance, an error. And also look at the numbered page, R2. Remember before my previous presentation, I mentioned that these pages are numbered with letters as well. 1A, 2A's, 3A's, 4A's, and it's all in alphabetical order. This one happens to land on the page with 5 R's and a 2. So what do we have? Latin gematria for R is 17. 5 17s is 85. 2 85s is 170. So we add the numbers together as we always have. 17 plus 0, 17. It's pretty obvious what they're saying here. 17th Earl of Oxford, Henry Wolsey's typographical error son, Henry. Just to give some perspective of this, Henry Wolsey, the 3rd Earl of Southampton, was convicted of treason in the Essex Rebellion and confined for his fate in the Tower of London during Queen Elizabeth's reign. When King James took over, he was freed and became a Knight of the Garter. And in 1605, his first son was named after King James. However, the author, editor, typesetter made the error of changing it to Henry, and we know that Henry Vere was the son of Southampton. Isn't this coincidence, typographical error, a swipe at King James? And finally, the page number, 1031. So let's add those together, 10 and 31, we get 41. Now we think Henry Vere was not his legitimate son, but the son of Southampton. So Henry Vere would not have been the 40th monarch. That would have fallen upon Edward Vere, the illegitimate son of Valdesar. However, for the purpose of the general public and this publisher, put this typographical error under Southampton for his issue, which should be James, as Henry, on a page in which the numbers add to 41. Again, coincidence? This concludes this latest video. Thank you for watching. My next video, I'm going to discuss the Ox 40 word used in the Catalogue of Honor and what I think it means.